My name is Noreen Tomasi, and I'm the director here of the Center for Fiction. And there is lots of information about the Center for Fiction on your seats in this brochure. And so I won't take the time to go over everything we do, but I want to encourage you to read this, to take it home with you, to look at our other events that are scheduled for this fall, to look at the pictures of our gorgeous space in Brooklyn that will be opening in October 2018, and to go to our website and learn more about everything we do. I want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of this project and what has happened so far. About a year ago, I became interested or challenged by how little I knew about the human brain and how much of what was going on in science that was interesting was happening in the field of neuroscience. And so we talked with the National Endowment for the Arts, who are very receptive to the idea of us putting in a proposal to do this series, which includes 5 adult events, children's events, and commission papers, all focused on the intersections of creativity and the brain. And at each event, we try to put together neuroscientists and writers in conversation about a particular aspect that is of great interest at the moment. Our first event featured Megan Meyer from the Princeton Social Neuroscience Lab, and just to catch you up a little before we start tonight. And the focus of that was a study they did using writers, 100 writers and other creatives, to try to map how their brains functioned when they were being creative. And there was a control group of almost 100 non-creators. They used lawyers for that. Apologies to any lawyers in the audience. And because I think it's very creative. And so they asked him to do a questionnaire, but one of the more interesting things, they filled out the questionnaire, and the questionnaire was about the difference between proximal imagination and distal imagination. That is, proximal imagination is how you imagine what you're going to do this evening, how you imagine the face of a friend. Distal imagination is how you imagine what the world might be 100 years ago, or how you imagine the emotional and intellectual life of someone very unlike you. And they tested the creatives versus the control group to see how they use their brains. One of the most interesting things they found was their hypothesis was this. Non-creative people can throw ball. We can all throw ball, right? Throw ball. Creative people use the same muscles to throw ball, but they throw like they're pitching for the Yankees, right? That was the model. Well, that turned out not to be true. In fact, when we throw the ball, we're using one part of our brain. When creative people throw the ball, they're using an entirely different part of their brain. And when they imaged the brains, they found that. So the brains of creative people, in relation to the distal imagination, function in entirely different ways, and in ways we, with our proximal imaginations, haven't imagined. So that's where we are going into this event. This event is, I feel so lucky to have Joyce Carol Oates and Charles Gross, and I will read their bios in a minute, but I have to say that I just finished Joyce's most recent book, and I recommend it so much if you want a look at an absolutely astonishing imagination. That book is one to read, and one of the most impressive things about it is how she enters the mind and the emotional and intellectual life of a person utterly unlike anyone I know, and I would think probably unlike anyone Joyce knows. And so we have a number of events still coming up. We have How We Love with Garth Greenwell and Lucy Brown, who is a neuroscientist in the field of romantic love and obsession. We have How We Inherit with Adam Hazlitt and Rebecca Brockman, who's a pioneer in the field of preventative psychopharmacology and inherited mental illness. And then we have How We Experience with Zia Halder Rahman, Mark De Silva, and Eric Hoel, who is one of our emerging writing fellows this year, who is a brilliant writer and also happens to be a brilliant neuroscientist and the head of YHouse. So that's what's happening. Now, tonight, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about how we see, how the brain functions when we see, and how a writer uses vision in their work. And we're also going to talk about the issue of memory, because these things are somewhat related. And it will be interesting to talk about both of them, given Charlie Gross's work and given the things that Joyce writes about in two of her recent novels. So I'm now going to read the bios. Bear with me, because I'm better at talking than reading, oddly. Joyce is a recipient of the National Medal of Humanities, the National Book Critics Circle Ivan Sandroff Lifetime Achievement Award, the National Book Award, the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Fiction, and has several times been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. She has written some of the most enduring fiction of our time, including the national bestsellers We Were the Mulvaneys, Blonde, which was nominated for the National Book Award, and the New York Times bestseller The Falls, which won the 2005 Prix Femina. She is the Roger S. Berlin Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University and has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1978. Her most recent publications are the novel I was just speaking about, A Book of American Martyrs, and a collection, Dismember and Other Stories of Mystery and Suspense. Charles Gross is a neuroscientist specializing in vision and the functions of the cerebral cortex, and is a Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. He is the author of numerous academic papers and the books Brain, Vision, and Memory, Tales in the History of Neuroscience, and A Hole in the Head, More Tales in the History of Neuroscience, both published by MIT Press. In 2011, he was a biology instructor in the Prison University Project at San Quentin, California. He is a member of the National Academy of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has received the Distinguished Scientific Award from the American Psychological Association, and in 2016, the Lashley Award in Neuroscience from the American Philosophical Society. We're going to begin the evening with a kind of introductory statements and reading from Joyce, and then I'm going to join Joyce and Charlie on stage for a conversation. So please join me in welcoming the wonderful Joyce Carol Oates. Thank you.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. Is this working? How did you know what I said? It's amazing. Whenever I ask if it's working, people always say no, but it never seems to work. Is there some trick to it? Do I turn it on or something? Well, it's actually right here.
Just keep talking a bit and they'll turn it up as you talk.
Okay, so I'm talking now. Hello. Some people are back there. That looks like a statue. Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I have lots of wonderful memories of being here, and it's usually a very interesting audience with exciting questions. I look forward to that. So this is a very challenging subject, I think, the relationship of vision and memory to literature. And I thought I would put together some general comments. I'm beginning with Joseph Conrad, who famously said in his introduction to the Negro of the Narcissus, quote, "My task which I am trying to achieve is, by the power of the written word to make you hear, to make you feel. It is above, before all, to make you see. That and no more, and it is everything. That's probably the most concise statement. But how does fiction allow us to see? Language is naturally suited to suggest metaphor, and metaphor acts upon the brain in a way that's both cerebral and sensory. Somehow, through the power of association, the impression of vision is evoked. We're familiar with Homer's Wine Dark Sea, but there are I think it's not very common in literature of past centuries to evoke vision the way we do today in the 19th and 20th centuries and 21st centuries. There wasn't that kind of scrupulous attention that was focused on the physical world. There are probably not very many examples in most writers until we come to Shakespeare, who is so extraordinary. But I'll give you a wonderful example that you all know from Antony and Cleopatra. This is the evocation of Cleopatra, Enobarbus. I will tell you. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold. Purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold of tissue, over picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side her stood pretty dimpled boys, like smiling cupids, with diverse colored fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid, did. Oh, rare for Antony. It's really wonderful, isn't it? And so this is all evoked through language, and people are sitting in the audience really seeing something. There are very few metaphors in Hemingway because he didn't describe very many things. His people are not usually described, but he has a story, Hills Like White Elephants, in which there's a metaphor in the very title. In this story, he allows a woman to imagine the hills like white elephants, so it's like a simile. The hills were white in the sun and the country was dry and brown. And the woman says a little later when she's having a dialogue with her lover, well, they don't really look like white elephants. I just meant the coloring of their skin through the trees. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, there are many, many sensory details. It's very rich and lush. It seems to be tracing the disintegration of a woman, and the visceral element is very strong. So she's looking at the wallpaper. You probably all read this story, and the wallpaper seems to be almost alive. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. You follow the uncertain curves for a little distance before they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in contradictions. So I have other examples here, but I'll just conclude with James Joyce and John Updike. Joyce's writing is just packed with visual intensity and auditory images. He was the most sensuous of writers, and he was thrilled to evoke Dublin and people very much alive and speaking. This is the famous ending of The Dead, and you notice how he's describing snow falling, but then it becomes extremely emotionally metaphorical, which is my point that descriptions in literature are mostly emotionally impressionistic. Gabriel imagined snow falling on every part of the lonely churchyard where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, and on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. So we sort of see the snow, but we feel the snow, and it's through the music of the language we see it in a kind of interior way. And I'll just end with a typical description. John Updike had been trained as an artist, and he was extremely concerned with evoking the physical world. His writing is so beautiful for that reason. This is sort of a typical description of a woman, a young woman, quote, "She had retained her beautiful calm, a sleepless tranquility marked by that pretty little blue puffiness below the eyes." It's a kind of story, almost a sadistic story. He focused so much on this woman who seems to have been based on somebody that he had had an affair with. I even found a metaphor in my novel, a Book of American Martyrs. I was looking through it, and I don't really have a lot of visuals. I think they're not that usual in that novel. And this is one I found on page 352, if anyone's interested. Quote, "Dense, deep, dark-ribbed clouds like the hollowed-out inside of a giant leviathan." The girl who sees this is an evangelical Christian, so she looks up at the sky and she's seeing these ribbed clouds, and it's dark, and it looks like she's in the interior of a great leviathan. And when I wrote it, it was appropriate for her situation. Now I'm going to read a few pages from my novel of last year, which is called The Man Without a Shadow. And this was very exciting to me because it's about a woman neuroscientist, and she is somebody who could be my colleague at Princeton, somebody whom my husband might have worked with. She's a realistically depicted scientist. As you know, most scientists in literature are somewhat satirical. They may be evil, malevolent, they're kind of crazy, like Dr. Frankenstein and Dr. Strangelove and people like that. But I thought I would write a novel about a person who's a real human being, very sincere, not flawless, not perfect, but a real person. Hello. Here's the first surprise. Eli Hoops greets Margaret Sharp with such eager warmth. It's as if he has known her for years, as if there's a profound emotional attachment between them. The second surprise is the man himself, who is nothing like Margaret Sharp has expected. It is October 17, 1965, the single defining moment of Margaret Sharp's life, as it will be the single defining moment of Margaret Sharp's career. Purely coincidentally, it is the eve of her 24th birthday when she is introduced by Professor Milton Ferris to the amnesiac patient Eli Hoops as a student in Professor Ferris's neuropsychology laboratory at the university. Margaret is the youngest and most recent addition to the renowned memory laboratory. She has been accepted by Ferris as a first-year graduate student, and she is dry-mouthed with anticipation. For weeks, she has been reading material pertinent to Project EH. Yet the amnesiac EH is so friendly and so gentlemanly, she feels comforted at once. The man is unexpectedly tall, at least 6'2". He is straight-backed, vigorous. His skin exudes a warm glow, and his eyes appear to be normal, though Margaret knows that the vision in his left eye is very poor. He is not at all the impaired individual she has expected to meet, who had to relearn a number of basic physical skills since the devastating injury to his brain just 15 months before, when he was 37. Margaret thinks that EH emanates an air of manly charisma, that mysterious quality to which we respond instinctively without being able to explain. He is well-dressed, preppy style, in clean khakis, a long-sleeve linen shirt, oxblood moccasins with patterned cotton socks, in contrast to the other patients at the Institute, whom Margaret has glimpsed lolling about in hospital gowns or rumpled civilian wear. She has been told that EH is a descendant of an old, distinguished Philadelphia family named Hoops, one-time Quakers who were central to the Underground Railroad in the years preceding the Civil War. He has a large extended family in the area, but no wife, children, or parents. Is it strange that Eli Hoops is unmarried at nearly 40? Margaret wonders if this somewhat patrician individual has had a history of relationships with women in which the women were found wanting and cast aside, never guessing that his time for love, marriage, and fathering children would come so abruptly to an end. Camping alone on an island in Lake George, New York, the previous summer, E.H. was infected by a particularly virulent strand of herpes encephalitis that usually manifests itself as a cold sore on a lip and fades within a few days. In E.H.'s case, the viral infection traveled along his optic nerve and into his brain, resulting in a prolonged high fever that ravaged his memory. This is certainly based on something that really happened. It was a mosquito that was infected. Unfortunately, he lingered too long before calling for help. Like a morbidly curious scientist, he'd recorded his temperature in a notebook and pencil. The highest recording reading was 103.1 degrees Fahrenheit before he collapsed. In the vast Adirondack region, there had been no first-rate hospital, no adequate medical care for such a rare and catastrophic infection. By the time the delirious and convulsing man had been brought by ambulance to the Albany Medical Center Hospital, where emergency surgery was performed to reduce the swelling in his brain, it was already too late. Something essential had been destroyed in his brain, and the damage appears to be irreversible. It is Milton Ferris's hypothesis that the damaged region is a small, seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus, located just above the brainstem and contiguous with the cerebral cortex, about which not as much known, but which seems to be essential for the consolidation and storage of memory. And so E.H. can form no new memories, and his memories of the past are erratic and uncertain. In clinical terms, he suffers from partial retrograde amnesia and total anterograde amnesia. Though he continues to test high on standardized IQ tests, and despite his seemingly normal appearance and manner, E.H. is capable of remembering new information for more than 70 seconds. Often it's less than that. 70 seconds, a nightmare to contemplate. Thank you.
So now what we need to determine, you know you can hear Joyce and I, but we need to determine if you can hear Charlie.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, great. So thank you, Joyce. That was wonderful. But I have so many questions. But I want to begin. Maybe I thought, since we are an audience of 90% utter laymen, maybe you could begin, Charlie, by telling us a little bit about how vision functions in the brain.
Well, a common idea might be that there are pictures in the brain, as if there was a TV set up there showing images. In fact, there's nothing like that at all. There are no pictures in the brain, there are no images in the brain, but rather what happens at each stage is that neurons detect the presence or absence of some aspect of the stimulus and send that message onward. So there is a series of visual areas. In people, maybe 40, and they are specialized with different aspects of vision. So if we start in the eye, in the retina, which is actually part of the brain that's been pushed out in development. So in the retina, the cells are sensitive to edges of light. And then they send information about the presence or absence of an edge of light in a certain part of the visual field. They send it up to the rear of the brain, to the first visual area, known as V1, visual area 1, also a striate cortex. And there, the information is further processed, and neurons can now detect the orientation of a line, the orientation of an edge. And they can also tell the length of the line, or the length of an edge. So then this information is then passed on to a series of other visual areas. Now things get specialized, but about half of these 40 areas are specialized for looking at, for analyzing form and color. So the neurons in this stream that's concerned with the question of what, that's to say, form and color. The cells now are sensitive to color, they're sensitive to shape, And then there's a whole series of areas where the process goes on, until finally there are areas where the neurons are sensitive to faces. They respond to faces. Or another area where the neurons respond to places. Or another area where the neurons respond to body parts. So that's the what stream, as it's called. There's also another stream, a where stream, which is sensitive to movement and location, which is sensitive to whether something is moving and where it is located. So our recognition of the world is then the result of these 40 or so specialized visual areas. There's a hierarchy of visual areas.
So this explains then why I've always been so puzzled by how someone, an artist, for example, like Chuck Close, could be such a wonderful visual artist and yet have face blindness.
That's right, because he has his visual areas are very much intact except for the face area.
Huh.
So some people have face blindness because of a tumor or injury. That's the most common reason for face blindness. But it turns out a small proportion of people, like maybe 2%, are terrible at recognizing faces. Mm-hmm. And it turns out their face area is simply not very active. Mm-hmm. So when you show a face to most everybody else, this face area gets very active. But if you show it to one of these people who have a developmental face blindness, as it's called, prosopagnosia, that's the technical word for face blindness. When you show a person like this a face, their face area will be inactive.
So then is it possible also that for a writer, so there could be, one of the things I was noting in Joyce's examples was the variety of ways that writers depict the visual experience and the way that they use it metaphorically. So is it possible that different writers then have different ways of seeing, and therefore that gets translated into their work? They're actually seeing differently or recognizing differently?
Well, people act differently from one another.
Yes.
In fact, we all act different from everybody else. Therefore, by definition, our brains have to be different. Mm-hmm. Because after all, our behavior is based on our brain, and if we behave differently, if two people behave differently, then there's some difference in their brains that usually is unknown, except in the extreme cases, like face blindness. We know they can't see faces because their face area is inactive.
Yes.
There are writers who are very conceptual, and the writers are very sensuous. Edna O'Brien, Colette, for instance, are very sensual writers, but conceptual writer would be somebody like Samuel Beckett. You know, you can read his prose fiction, and there's a lot of wonderful language, but you don't really see anything.
So if you put Samuel Beckett and Colette in an imaging machine, it's possible you might pick up differences in their brains.
Borges is an example. I think Calvino. But then John Updike is even trained as an artist. People are different. I've been teaching for a long time. Some of my students are very conceptual and intellectual, and it's as if the world doesn't exist. Other students are describing things very beautifully, and they're like painters. It's just very, very obvious.
I wonder, though, there is a kind of generally received idea that what we see is there, and we're all seeing it the same way. We know that this isn't true in color, right? Because we've all argued with someone about painting a room or something, right? We know that we don't perceive color in the same way, but we think that we perceive a landscape or an object or that fireplace, whatever, in exactly the same way. But you're saying that's not necessarily true, Charlie.
Well, since some people are visual and some people are conceptual, then their brains have to be different.
Mm-hmm. Some people
Except we don't know what the differences are. But it would be interesting to look at people, to image people who have very different visual imagery.
Mm-hmm. You brought up something that I thought was so interesting, Joyce, when you spoke about how the Greeks, for example, their literature was not full of visual imagery. There are some exceptions to that. And I found that very interesting. Do you find that that's an evolution over, it gets more visual, or is there some certain point in the 19th century where people begin to really describe the visual more?
I think that's the movement toward reality. The earliest forms of art are very fantastical and allegorical and simple. And they may be about gods or devils, but they're not realistic. And it takes a long time in history before you move away from the kind of beautiful language of Shakespeare, King Lear, for instance, to the kind of rantings and ravings of somebody today. Shakespeare wouldn't have had Lear muttering and ranting like somebody with Alzheimer's, but it's quite possible that today we would have that kind of replication. It was in the 19th century that the world of reality became suddenly very exciting, and people started painting it and looking at it, and things that are considered vulgar and diminished, spiritually diminished or not spiritual at all, became subjects for art. That didn't exist before. Everything was sort of elevated before.
Yeah, but art and painting existed a long time ago. In fact, long before we have any evidence of writing. Things like Lascaux caves and similar caves of early are very visual and very vivid.
But they don't like it's not like Lucian Freud. I mean, it's not like Lucian Freud or Philip Polstein. I mean, it's not that kind of real staring at almost a molecular level. It's more like generalized and fantastical.
So, for example, when you look at a cave painting, or you look at something in the interior of an Egyptian tomb, you see the lack of perspective. And you don't really, Johnny, you'll know, but you don't really get a sense of when perspective, I wonder if when perspective enters painting, is it entering because people are starting to see differently, or just they're better at it?
Well,
they're better, their technique is better.
Well, in traditional
he might know.
Chinese landscape painting, the perspective is different from Western, but it's incredibly detailed, evocative, symbolic.
It's true.
I can't think of anything more visually elaborate than a Chinese landscape painting.
That's true.
But it's symbolic. It's not literal. It's not natural.
Well, you know, people used to say that about the Chinese landscape painting, that it looked so fantastic, it was symbolic, man is small, nature is big, and so on. But when you go to China, and you go to National Park, it actually looks like a Chinese landscape painting.
Yes, but you might see litter. You might see litter on the ground. You might see some plastic bottles on the ground, and you see ugly, awful-looking people. They're not in that art. That's a very elevated and very fantastical, beautiful art, but it's not what I mean by naturalism.
It's true.
I don't think so. And these classic paintings say there are these paintings of,
He's always like this.
of the emperor of the emperor coming and taking a tour of the South. So there are hundreds of people in the painting. There are animals, there are babies, there are children, there are people selling stuff, there are people eating. There's all the life of whatever it was, 4th century China.
Well, Bruegel has a lot of
Yeah.
real life, too.
I want to go back to, I was fascinated by the history of neuroscience in both of your books, part 1 and part 2, and by how much we learned by dissection and study, someone like Leonardo da Vinci, others predating him, but then also how much we learn by, I don't want to say by accident, but by accident, like this case study in your novel, Joyce. And I don't mean to switch abruptly into the idea of memory, but neuroscience progresses both deliberately and accidentally in a certain way, hasn't it, Charlie?
Well, yes. For most of the history of neuroscience, for the first 2,000 years at least, there were very few experiments on humans, and all the information about the human brain came from accidents, came from injury. So there's a nice example right here in Joyce's book where HM is where, what's the name of the book?
The Man Without a Shadow?
No, I mean the character in your book.
Oh, his EH. I call him EH.
Okay, anyhow,
It's
EH
based on HM.
is based on HM, who started the modern study of memory. And before this guy was studied, this guy very well described in the extract that Joyce read, nothing was known about the role of the brain in memory. Nothing was known about different parts of the brain involved in memory. Nothing was known about is there one type of memory, or the different types of memory, maybe the short and long term, but what else? But as a result of the study of this one patient, this really revolutionized the whole study of human memory. We discovered that there's a part of the brain, the hippocampus, which is crucial for things to get stored. They're not stored there, but it's crucial for things to go from short to long-term memory. And then they travel to other parts of the brain, that's a metaphor, where they're stored for long term. And then it turns out there are different kinds of memory. So this patient that you heard about, although he can't remember anything that happened to him for more than a couple of minutes, his ability to learn a skill, to ride a bicycle, to learn to play the piano, to do a jigsaw puzzle, and so on, is completely and totally intact. So from that we discovered that there are a number of different kinds of memory that involve different parts of the brain. And in his case, he's lost a memory for facts, and he's lost a memory for experience. But all these other sorts of memories, like skills in doing a jigsaw puzzle and reading upside down and riding a bicycle and so on, are intact.
So, Joyce, what attracted you to that story? What made you decide to make that a novel and enter some other realm of imagination and metaphor with that story?
Well, that's a very good question. I became so interested in it. It became really, really mesmerizing. Suzanne Corkin, who is a very distinguished neuroscientist at MIT who died about 2 years ago, has written the major book on HM. It's called Permanent Present Tense, the astonishing life of HM. So his name was not known generally. It was kept secret for his protection, I think. But now we know what his name is. Anyway, so I read that book, and Charlie, who is actually my husband, maybe people don't know that, Charlie has a wonderful library of the history of science, history of neuroscience, and in the house he has all these wonderful books. And I think the book from Suzanne Corkin came in because it probably came to Charlie rather than me. So I read that. It was so interesting because the woman actually seems to have fallen in love with this very impaired man. But every time she met him for how many years? Was it 30 years?
40 or 50 years.
Every time she met him, for him it was the first time. And he never remembered her. He did have some non-declarative memory of some things that he could do, but he never remembered her. In my novel, though, he acquires a kind of non-declarative memory. He doesn't exactly remember her, but he remembers some emotion of some kind. So I feel that was probable. And everything in my novel is actually absolutely accurate because Charlie read it. He read it twice.
And well, that sounds like interesting description of a marriage.
You're not supposed to fall in love or be emotionally involved with a patient.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not professional, and yet it might happen. In this case, it happens almost innocently, and she becomes so devoted to him that when other people, like his family, have no use for him, she wants to sort of take care of him. So it becomes a story about loving someone who basically can't really love you back. What do you do when somebody no longer recognizes you and doesn't love you, doesn't have a feeling for you? Can you still love that person? And I thought yes. That's my feeling.
That whole idea of recognition is so key. It's key to emotional attachment, but it's also key to the stories we tell. The moments of recognition in novels, the turns of recognition is so central to so many great novels.
Yes.
And it's sort of, in a way, to recognize one another and to recognize certain things is kind of what makes us human in a certain way, no?
Well, Charlie had actually met H.M. and worked with him a little bit. What else about
Did you
him?
like him, Charlie?
He was a very pleasant fellow.
Yeah.
Charlie, you want to talk about Phineas Fogg? Is that his name? It's kind of interesting.
He was quite intelligent, and he was a very good subject. He was very patient, and occasionally he would say things like, "Every day is new to me."
Yeah.
But he didn't seem to be depressed or sad.
He wasn't troubled by this?
Well, it's possible his part of the brain that was destroyed included a large part of his hippocampus, but it also included a part of an adjacent structure known as the amygdala. And the amygdala is very important for feeling and emotions, both positive and negative. And a bit of his flatness of his emotion may have been due to the fact that his amygdala was damaged.
Because they study now that in relation to drugs for depression and for psychosis and things, there's a focus on that area of the brain to regulate mood.
That's right.
Yeah.
How old was he when he had his surgery? 16? 18?
Maybe 20-something.
I thought it was younger than that. But in my character was 37, so he had more of a life and more experiences, whereas H.M. may have not had that much, quite as much emotion.
I want to return a little bit to the general because we're talking about memory, but we're also talking about seeing. And I think we're all familiar in literature with the idea of the senses triggering memory. Of course, Proust is the main example, right? Taste and also the sense of smell triggers memory, and we're familiar with that from literature. But what about the sense of sight? And I don't mean, I see that and I remember that thing, but I mean, in the way that a certain smell evokes a whole period, does sight work in the same way in relation to memory as a trigger?
Well, smell is a little bit different. The main component in the taste of Proust's cookie is probably olfaction.
Yes.
Okay. Olfactory memories are set up weaker, but last much longer. So olfactory memories decay much more slowly than visual memories. So the Proust cookie really reflects the fact that you do remember the taste of a cookie more and more vividly than you do other things.
That's fascinating. Does everyone know that already? I didn't know that.
The smell of lilac for me is very evocative.
It is. But we don't ordinarily evoke a memory, say, of childhood by looking, say, at a certain kind of tree, or, no, it's not the same because they actually know that the length of the visual memory is not as long as the length of an olfactory memory.
That's right. Of course, the children is a special case because although very young children can learn, you can teach them things, even only a few months old, there's this phenomenon of infantile amnesia, where they tend not to remember anything for the first 3 or 4 years of their life. So although they can learn in this period, nothing seems to get permanently stored. It's not clear really.
That's a mystery, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder why that is the case.
So it seems to me, to go back to earlier, this idea of the proximal and the distal imagination, being in the moment and being in a much broader understanding of the world, isn't that kind of a description of writing fiction?
Well, I don't know. A lot of what Shakespeare writes so vividly, he had not experienced. You know, he didn't see Cleopatra. He describes Othello, and he describes a lot of Jew. I think he'd never seen a Jew. You know, he was. If you're brilliant, I guess you can just do anything. You know? I mean, he describes things and evokes them so vividly. You'd certainly think that he knew at firsthand that he is imagining.
Yeah, yeah. But in the act of writing, you're both removed from the present, but very deeply into a certain reality. Is that your experience?
Well, some writers like James Joyce and many others are most vividly involved in recollection when they're not in the place that they're writing about. Most of Joyce's life he spent in exile from Dublin. He was totally fascinated with Dublin. But if you're actually living in New York, it may be the hardest thing then to evoke New York. But if you leave New York for a few months, then the mind does things and you start selecting out and you can write much better about it.
I'm hogging the questioning, and I want to open it to the audience because I think this subject is pretty fascinating, and I know we have a few people in the audience who have thought about some of these issues a lot, and we're happy to take some questions. We'll start here and then go there. Yes?
Hi, you were referring to the distal and the proximal, and the distal where a writer is not remembering something, but actually inventing. And even though we don't have a screen in our brain with pictures, it certainly seems like a screen when you're inventing something that doesn't exist and describing a dragon. And so where does that happen in the brain?
Where do you imagine something that you're not seeing that isn't there? Frontal lobe?
Well, well, to get anatomical, remember I talked about that a part of the visual system that is concerned with the question of what? Color and form. That's actually in the temporal lobe. And then there's the part that, a series that is concerned with motion and space, and that's in the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe being right above the ear, and the parietal lobe being right above that. And so it's in the temporal lobe where you seem to have activity in dreaming and in imagining things.
Okay. And here?
Thank you all for being here. This is really great. Sorry. I'm talking on Saturday to a guy who has been blind since birth, and he believes he sees through echolocation. They call him the Batman. And I'm really excited to talk to him. They've done a study of his brain, and they say that his brain lights up even more than somebody who's visually sighted. And I just wanted to give any thoughts, or if he's just crazy and I'd be taken down.
Well, blind people have a crude, primitive version of echolocation that is so exquisitely developed in the bat. And so many blind people have a version of that. Sometimes it's called facial vision, but it's essentially like the bat. They're picking up a reflected sound. So he's not making it up.
He's not. We had another question there, and then I'll take you. Yes?
This idea of HM and the immediacy of his life, and you're writing a story about an individual who's similar. How how does he construct, or how does one construct a sense of self? Because self seems to be a conglomerate of past experiences, interpreted, related, remembered. But if you're always in the immediate.
Well, he remembers most of his life from before the surgery, or at least for 2 or 3 years before the surgery. He remembers his childhood. And so his sense of self is probably derived from that period in his life, and that is reflected in the fact that he can't quite realize how old he is until when he sees his picture, or when he sees himself in the mirror. He's surprised because in his sense of self, he's still young.
In my novel, I have a lot of experiments, and they're very interesting. They're based on reality. For instance, say you had a catastrophic accident and your hippocampus was destroyed. You would remember everything up to tonight, or almost, you know. But you wouldn't be able to process new memories. You're going to remember things for about 70 seconds. So if somebody had an experiment showing you photographs of celebrities and famous people, you would identify all of them, and then as it moved into the, you know, what to you would be the future, you suddenly wouldn't know anybody. This is a dividing line. You wouldn't recognize anybody. Because you're frozen. Permanent present tense is a title of Suzanne Corkin's book, Permanent Present Tense.
There's a question here, and then I'll do.
This is a creative question for Joyce. When you discovered HM and you said you became mesmerized with him, was there something related to sight memory that prompted you to dig deeper to write about him? Like, where was the correlation between knowing about him and then being kind of motivated and creatively driven to?
Did everyone hear
the
the?
novel?
Did everyone hear the question? It's a question about Joyce's process, her interest in HM, and what motivated her to sort of go beyond the initial interest into a deeper examination of this questions of memory in the novel.
I don't think we understand all the unconscious reasons that push us toward being attracted to some subjects. But because of Charlie coming into my life, I have all these books and a whole new way of looking at things, which is essentially scientific rather than poetic or humanistic or whatever I am. The scientific imagination is actually a bit different. And I'm sure that his brain is quite different from the poet's brain. So what I perceive that a young woman scientist might take HM or EH as her subject, I sort of could identify with her, that she's somebody who's young and she's fascinated with this new phenomenon. And she creates in his imagination, his fleeting memory. She's always creating herself. You know, it's almost a little bit what we do with people anyway. So at some point, she gets the brilliant idea. He's got memory up until the age of 37. He's got a memory when he was in high school. He had some girlfriends. She fixes her hair so that she resembles some of these old lost girlfriends from his past. And so when he sees her, he has this complex emotional response. Of course, he sort of remembers an emotional connection. Even though the literal woman is new every day to him, he still is evoking that. And I think we do a lot of that evocation with people whom we know. We tap something unconsciously that makes them like us, or know us, or identify us. We hide from them things that make them feel they don't know us, especially our parents.
Yes.
So here's a question, just what role does synesthesia, cross-stimuli, play in creativity and one in memory, and how does it actually work in the brain?
This is a question about synesthesia.
It's cross-stimuli,
Well,
seeing colors.
Yeah, well, real synesthesia, as opposed to just metaphorical, is quite rare. So although there are writers and musicians and so on that are synesthetic, most people aren't. So therefore, synesthesia can't play a role in most creative work. Now to your other question about what's the origin in the brain, we don't know, but it is interesting that a very common form of synesthesia is colored numbers. You know, people see numbers as colored. 5's are red and 3's are green and so on. And the part of the brain that's concerned with color appears to be right next door to the part of the brain that's concerned with numbers.
Oh.
So therefore, somebody, particularly a well-known neuroscientist called, well, Rama for short, suggested that's because there is crosstalk in synesthetics between these two adjacent areas.
I
That's
see.
a speculation. But
And music too, it seems.
Can you hear colors also?
sure.
In synesthesia, yes.
Oh, sure, sure.
Without being in a mushroom state.
Who's the famous musician? Are there a number of musicians who had colored
Synesthesia.
Synesthesia. I think maybe more
Synesthesia.
musicians than any other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we have time for 2 more questions. So here,
Yeah, I was just interested in the relationship that you see between plasticity in the brain and creativity. And can someone become more creative through practice or some kind of some kind of habit of mind? And yeah, some comment on that.
Joyce is the expert on criteria.
No, but Charlie has actually pioneered in plasticity, or neurogenesis, it's called. Do you want to answer the question?
I can't answer it, so it has to be one of you two.
Well, neurogenesis is very real, and it,
We don't know what the neural basis of creativity is.
but
Although apparently the speakers last week had interesting ideas on it.
They did, but it remains to be seen.
But if I can say one thing, physical energy, physical vitality and exercise will definitely help your creativity. That helps neurogenesis.
And why is that?
Well, you have to ask the neuroscientist.
Well, let me show. I don't know about creativity, but we now know that in the hippocampus of adults, there are new neurons are born every day, and they're born throughout your life. Okay, so that's well known. So we get new neurons in the hippocampus, and we know the hippocampus is important for memory, and we know at least in animals these new neurons are important for memory. So that's well established. The second thing that is well established is that running induces neurogenesis. Not creativity, I don't know about creativity, but the more you run, the more you get new neurons in the hippocampus, and at least in the case of rats, the better your memory is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so we don't know, and we know at least in rats, strength training doesn't do it, but running does do it. Now, to what extent this applies to humans, we don't know, but the basic fact that running enhances new neurons in the hippocampus is real. Unlike crossword puzzles, brain games, Sudoku, and all the stuff that is advertised on television to making you smarter, you'll do a lot better, probably maybe not necessarily running, but maybe just going outside and having a nice walk.
Mm-hmm. Joyce, you wanted to say?
Oh, I was going to say definitely running gives you new ideas. Everybody I know who's a writer who also runs, and students, they always say that it's very exciting. You run along and new ideas come to you, particularly spatially structural things. You're working on a novel that you require. There's no doubt about it. If you just sit in the chair, there's a kind of stasis. But when you're running, ideas just come to you. It's really amazing. I've been running all my life, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know about this until just recently. I didn't know that there was...
So we have scientific and anecdotal evidence in this area.
Yes, he's scornful of anecdotal evidence.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, maybe we'll take 2 more. So here and one more.
And I'm not quite sure, but Coleridge has this wonderful, maybe it was his own imagination, one of his writings, and he described the difference in the associative imagination and sort of the more literal one. I don't quite remember his words, and it's so beautiful. And I was wondering if that's still valid today, and whether, you know, then people say, well, everyone with that associative kind of mind, they do spider diagrams now with the kids and web outlines as opposed to linear ones, and they say that, you know, all those people have ADD or something. But I'm wondering if I mean, I think that there's a lot of validity. There's, you know, people who see all the different sides of things and they just think so differently, as opposed to the, you know, my husband and I are totally opposite, and he's, you know, 1, 2, 3 in order. And does that show up differently on brains, you know, when they look at the process of how someone just thinks or reacts to something and imagines? Does that, you know, the difference in, maybe it's in different areas of the brain, or they're doing the same thing? I mean, you know, give them the same.
I don't want to repeat the platitude, but if you behave differently, your brains are different.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, it's true, the next day, you can behave in, you know, in opposite ways and so on.
And your brain would then behave in an opposite way. Yeah. Okay.
Or some third way.
Okay. We have, yeah.
A question for Ms. Oates. I came out of a film background. How did you feel about the film Smooth Talk that was based on one of your short stories? Are you familiar with it?
The Smooth Talk is a feature film that was based on my short story, Where You're Going, Where Have You Been? It was a long time ago. Well, it was Laura Dern's debut, and it was really a wonderful film that was written, a full-length film out of a short story. So it's basically quite different from my story, and has a happy ending. My story had a tragic ending. But I was very happy about it, and it's endured. People still watch it.
Yes.
So that says something quite remarkable.
The screen door.
Yeah, it's actually quite beautiful.
And so
Well, many people, apparently dozens of films have been made about that story, because everybody who goes to film school read that story in high school, and apparently they like to make films of it.
I've seen many of them, yes.
And so interestingly, so as you wrote that story, you were visualizing and creating, but you don't feel a vested interest in your visualization of the story. You're interested in how other people visualize it.
Oh, definitely. Professionals bring to bear a whole different set of talents.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Charlie. This has been fascinating.